Hi everyone, my name is Affaf and I work with ACCA as an expert tutor for advanced audit and assurance. So I'm going to make sure that the technical concepts are covered in such a way that you can retain the key technical knowledge and also apply it to exam scenarios. We're going to use an extract from the study hub to look at the syllabus requirements. You can prepare these two topics entirely from this video as the content incorporates the key technical knowledge as well as the answering techniques that we're going to look at through examples. Now, using the work of others is covered in chapter 10 of the study hub. Experts have been covered in a separate video. We'll be focusing on the work of internal auditors and service organizations in this one. It is very important that you read through and understand the technical knowledge which is covered in chapter 10. Please do use the flashcards because they'll help you revise your key concepts and attempt the quizzes and the revision questions so that you can identify any knowledge gaps and keep sort of track of your progress over time as well. We'll start off with the work external or statutory auditors need to do if they want to use the work of their clients' internal auditors. So during the course of our statutory or external audit, if we want to use the client's internal auditor's work, this is what we're going to be looking at. What you see on the screen right now is a very good summary from the study hub. It outlines the areas that internal auditors normally look at. We know from AA that many organizations have internal audit functions as a part of their internal control and governance structures. So internal auditors would basically be working to improve the effectiveness of their company's governance, risk management, and internal control processes. Internal auditors will also or might also be performing tests to make sure that the controls are designed properly and they're operating effectively with regards to financial reporting. Additionally, they would also be reviewing compliance with laws, regulations, and internal policies. But the work they do, their responsibilities, their authority, etc., is going to vary depending on the size of the organization. So if two different organizations have internal audit departments or functions, that does not mean they have the same authority, they have the same reporting lines, or they have the same type of tasks. This will vary organization to organization. The key reason why we're looking at this is in the context of external audit, right? So our entire focus is how we can use their work as a part of external audit. We need to evaluate the design and operating effectiveness of internal controls related to financial statements as external auditors. So we already know that this is something that we have to do. We can, if we want to, use the internal auditor's work to gather evidence to some extent instead of doing everything all over again. So the same systems over financial reporting that we are going to test, the internal auditors would have tested already. So not 100% reliance, but what we can do if we want to, we can use their work provided we are happy with a few factors. Additionally, and this is something which is relatively less common, so please be alert about this, we could also be using the internal audit function to provide direct assistance to us. So we're not just using their work, we're actually getting them to do the work for us. So we are going to be focusing on both these aspects, and please be very careful about the requirements in your exam so you can identify what we're actually being asked to talk about. A few key things that you need to keep in mind: we do not have to rely on their work or use them for direct assistance. This remains a decision of the external auditors as they develop the overall audit strategy. So if there's any indication that the client's management is saying that you have to do it, you can pick that up to say that is not a compulsion. In any case, and this is the same with experts as well, the external auditors will have the sole responsibility for the audit opinion that they ultimately express. This responsibility is not reduced if we use the work of internal auditors. So we can't really say that it's them who did the work. Ultimately, the opinion is still our responsibility. And for quality management questions and otherwise, please keep this in mind. There's no concept of complete reliance. We will have to reperform some of the work ourselves as well. Now, this screen is what we need to apply in questions in the AAA exam. So I'm just going to summarize this on one screen and we'll break it down later on. The first step is to evaluate if we can use their work or use them for direct assistance. We need to look at their independence, their competence, their experience, and how professionally their work was planned, etc. So we're going to look at this, but that's step number one. If we're happy with all of these, the next step is to decide which areas we can use their work in and to what extent. Remember, we have to give an opinion on the financial statements. So their work has to be relevant to the work on financial statements, and it cannot involve any areas of the financial statement which have a higher risk of material misstatement or where judgment is involved. So yes, we'll use the work which is relevant, but not in the areas where there is higher ROM or there's more judgment involved. Once that's done, so once this is done, we're then going to get the reports that the internal audit function have prepared. We're going to evaluate them, or if it's direct assistance, we're actually going to allocate the work to them. We're going to be looking at each of these in detail, but please remember, in a nutshell, this is the sequence that we should be following. Should we? If yes, after that evaluation, in which areas, to what extent, which work can we actually rely on, and if it's direct assistance, what are the additional elements we need to keep in mind, because we are the ones who are going to be directing and supervising their work. So we need to see if they have carried out their work without bias. So objectivity, as we've done a number of times before, is about working without bias. So for example, if you find out in a AAA question that the internal audit function reports to the finance director instead of the audit committee, you can say that their objectivity has been compromised and we will not be relying on their work or using their work. Similarly, internal auditors will not be objective if they have managerial operational responsibilities, or if their remuneration is decided by the executive management instead of those charged with governance. So you're going to be reading through the entire question and picking up any indication that the internal auditor's objectivity might have been compromised. There have been a number of questions in really old AAA pass exams where they've said that the internal auditors are not allowed to communicate with the external auditors unless it is through the finance director. And you'd obviously say their objectivity is compromised, we are not going to be using their work. To look at their competence, we can see if they are members of professional bodies. We can look at their experience, any industry-specific knowledge that they have. Plus, we also need to look at the fact that they have adequate resources based on the size of the organization and the nature of its operations. So for example, if it's a large multinational group and they have an internal audit function with 2 people in total, even if they are professionally qualified, this is not adequately resourced to be able to carry out their work. So in both cases, if you're not happy with their objectivity or competence, it could be even one of these, you're not going to be using their work. To see if they've applied a systematic and disciplined approach to their work, we can check to evaluate that all their work is documented. So everything from their plan to risk assessments to work programs to reporting, everything should be professionally documented. We'll also see if they have proper quality management policies and procedures, such as having a leader in charge of the internal audit function, proper resource management and engagement performance, etc. So the quality management guidelines that we studied in ISQM 1, if they've applied those, then yes, this is a function whose work we can rely on. So 3 areas you could either write as straightforward knowledge, which is rare, but mostly evaluate for a given scenario. Once we've determined that the work of the internal audit function can be used for statutory audit, we need to identify areas which are relevant to our overall audit strategy and plan. So common examples could include, we could use their work where they've tested operating effectiveness. So remember, we carry out test of controls to confirm the operating effectiveness. So if they've done it, we can use their work. We can use their work or direct assistance in substantive procedures in areas which do not involve judgment. We can use their work and maybe if send them for observing inventory counts. You can use them to trace transactions through the systems. So that's routine and mechanical, no judgment needed. You can use their work if they've already tested compliance with laws and regulations. Some important points to keep in mind again and again for AAA exams in particular are that we as external auditors will make all significant judgments in audit. Additionally, in areas where there's a higher risk of fraud or error, we are going to perform most of the work ourselves, and there should be very little reliance on the work of internal auditors. So we are now officially ready to use their work. We evaluated objectivity, competence, their professional standards. We've decided which areas we're going to use their work in, and now we're done. We basically need to start off with discussing the planned use of their work with them so that our activities can be coordinated. So we're going to obviously get in touch with the internal audit function and tell them this is what the plan is. We'll be reading their reports to understand the nature and the extent of procedures they've done. We're going to make sure that they've gathered sufficient appropriate evidence at whatever conclusions that were reached in the report are being supported by that evidence. We'll also check that the work of the function has been properly planned and performed and supervised along with reviewed and documented. So the idea is, if we have decided that these are the areas that we're going to use their work in, we're now on this screen actually looking at those reports. So this pretty much finishes the knowledge that you need to know about using the work of internal auditors. We're now going to be looking at direct assistance. I've done this just a few minutes ago, but very quickly, we're not using their work anymore. We're actually using them, the staff, to carry out work for us. Please remember, direct assistance is not allowed by some local laws and regulations. For example, in the UK, internal auditors cannot be used to give direct assistance to statutory auditors. So direct assistance is when we are going to ask them to carry out procedures for us. So step number 1 for questions in AAA, and of course this is the knowledge as well, we need to see if this is allowed by local laws and regulations. We need to evaluate their objectivity and competence like we did earlier on, and then we need to decide which areas can be assigned to them for direct assistance. We cannot assign areas which require significant audit judgments. We cannot assign areas with a higher risk of material misstatement. So in a number of past exam AAA questions, they said that we used internal auditors for direct assistance in the audit of allowances for doubtful debts, in the audit of financial instruments. Now, both of these areas require judgments. There's estimation involved. So you're going to pick that up and say that using internal auditors in these areas were not allowed, and explain why. Because they involve judgment and risk, we should not have used them as for direct assistance. We need to carry out work ourselves. Now, this is all done. We've actually decided that these are the areas we're going to get them to work for us. Say I'm just going to be getting them to confirm electricity bills and water bills and, routine and mechanical work. But before we actually execute this, there are 2 agreements that we need to get. We need to get a written agreement from our audit client that they are okay with us using their internal auditors for direct assistance. Plus, we need to get a written agreement from the internal auditors that they will keep the information confidential. So again, because our confidentiality requirements apply to them as well, we need to get them to sort of sign that. Ultimately, whatever work they do, we are the ones who have to direct, supervise, and review their work. So the ultimately responsibility remains with us. I would want you to pause this video and read this question and come back and listen to this outline that we're going to be looking at. Now, this is a company which is an existing audit client. It has a financial year end of 31st December. It's a listed company. They have a well-established internal audit department, which is managed by a qualified accountant with many years of experience. They've given an extract from the executive summary of the latest internal audit report to the finance director. So this report has been given to the finance director, and the report says we are pleased that the internal controls are working well. There have been no significant changes during the year. As a result of our test of controls, we have identified 2 financial irregularities. There was a failure to get authorization and approval regarding expense claims for an amount of 575,000, and there was inadequate access controls over the IT system, and because of this there was a payroll fraud amounting to 750,000. Now this is quite intriguing. Number one, they're reporting to the finance director, and number two, in spite of these quite major issues, remember it's not just the amount, it's that these control deficiencies are significant because of the future problems that this could also cause. And remember, fraud automatically is material by nature. So in spite of these problems, they're basically saying, oh, our controls are working well. We are required to discuss the matters to be considered in determining the assistance which could be provided by and the amount of reliance, if any, which can be placed on the organization's internal audit department. Now, this means if you look at the language, you are expected to talk about direct assistance as well as using the work of internal auditors. So you should start off with a quick outline of the sort of reliance we can have. You need to evaluate their objectivity, competence, and approach using information in the scenario. If there's no relevant information, just explain that content. And then you need to have a discussion regarding using internal auditors for direct assistance. So we'll start off by saying, yes, we can use the work of internal auditors to change the extent of our audit procedures. We'll have to consider if this is allowed by the local laws and regulations. We have to evaluate the internal auditor's objectivity, competence, and systematic approach. So this is my introduction, which is quite generic. Now, linking this to the scenario, I have concerns that the report is addressed to the finance director, which means their objectivity is compromised. In terms of competence, that it is managed by a qualified accountant, so seems competent. However, I need to look at the rest of the team members. Are they professionally qualified? Or if they have a training program for internal auditors, plus because this is a large group, I want to make sure there are sufficient number of people in the internal audit department. So everything that I did with you, we're just linking to the scenario. In terms of their competence, I have some additional points. They are saying the systems are working well in spite of the 2 instances of fraud. I need to know what the scope of their work was, what their recommendations were. I am also concerned that because they report to the finance director, maybe they were not allowed to investigate these any further. We have to write over here as well that if I'm not happy with their objectivity or competence, I'm not going to be relying on their work. Straightforward knowledge, I'm also going to be looking at whether their work was done in a systematic and disciplined way. We've covered relying on the work of internal auditors. Because the word assistance was used, we also need to outline direct assistance pretty much straightforward. If we want to use their function for direct assistance, we need to get an agreement from the management along with one from internal auditors regarding confidentiality. We cannot use their work for areas with high risk and judgment. So everything that we did was pretty much summarized in that particular question. We're now going to look at a completely different topic. And again, this is another example of others whose work we can rely on. So we're just going to step back for a second. And the situation is you have an audit client who has outsourced their payroll. We're going to learn how this affects our work as external auditors. So the topic is impact of outsourced functions on external audit. Okay, so I'm sure you know this already, but outsourcing is basically when we have an external specialist organization, which is also called a service organization, which is used to carry out functions which would normally be carried out by the client within the organization. So in my example of payroll, instead of recording those transactions myself, I've outsourced them to an organization, to an external specialist that we call a service organization. So if I say my audit client has outsourced payroll, this means that at least some part of payroll is being handled by another organization instead of my audit client. So commonly, functions that are outsourced could include data processing, payroll, internal audit, credit control functions, etc. Now, this entire situation is going to be relevant to external audit only if the outsourced services are a part of the client's system related to financial statements. So for example, if they've outsourced elements related to maintaining accounting records or initiating, recording or processing transactions or asset management like leased vehicles or finance functions like debt factoring, etc., then all of these would be relevant to external audit. Now, service organizations normally operate in two ways. One scenario could be that the service organization fully maintains the outsourced function, dealing with all aspects. This includes establishing accounting records, maintaining those records, and initiating transactions related to that function. In this case, if this is a fully outsourced function, there is a chance that our audit client may not have any internal records at all in relation to that function other than those provided by the service organization. So if it's fully outsourced, I need to be instantly alert whether there is a parallel check that is being maintained by our own client. Or it could be partial outsourcing. For example, the service organization only executes the transaction when the client requests it, or maybe acts as a custodian of assets. In this case, our client would probably be maintaining all internal records related to that function. So we're going to be looking at the contract to find out what the situation is. So from this screen, the key takeaway is service organization is the company that the function has been outsourced to. And this will only be relevant to us if it's related to the financial statements. And we will need to find out whether it is full outsourcing or partial outsourcing. We're going to quickly have a look at a few other terms that you need to be comfortable with before we learn how outsourcing should be considered during the audit process. User auditor is going to be normally us in the AAA exam. This is an auditor who's going to audit and report on the financial statements of the user entity. And user entity is the company which is using the service organization and whose financial statements we are auditing. So in the AAA exam, normally our client would be the user entity and we would be the user auditor. So this would be a role most of the time in the AAA exams. If we use or see the term service organization systems, I'm basically talking about the internal controls at the company the system has been outsourced to. So if I am ABC and the client, and I've outsourced my payroll to XYZ, then XYZ's systems are called service organization systems. This is quite self-explanatory as well. Their auditor. So service auditor is the person or the company which is auditing the service organization's controls, and they're going to give us assurance on their controls. See, this is very important. Just forget these technical concepts for just a few more minutes. See, we are auditing ABC company. ABC Co is our client. We had to test their systems on payroll, but we found out they've actually outsourced payroll to someone else. So we can't test their systems. We now need assurance on the service organization system. So their controls, for the assurance on their controls, we might be using the work of a service auditor. And as always, if we are going to use the work of the service auditor, we need to evaluate that they're professionally competent. We need to evaluate that they're independent from the service organization, and we need to see how professionally their work was done as well. Now remember, these are the terms you need to be comfortable with, but application is going to be slightly different when we talk about the AAA exam. These two terms are super important for the AAA exam, particularly because the examiner has said time and again in their report that these terms are something that the students or learners are not comfortable with. Let's understand these through an example. So my client, my audit client, has outsourced payroll to the service organization. I need their auditors to send me a report on their internal controls. So I can't go to them at the moment, suppose. So I need their auditors to send me that report. I can ask for a type 1 report or a type 2 report. In a type 1 report, they'll only report on whether the systems are designed well. In a type 2 report, along with assurance on the design of the system, they're also going to tell me if their systems are operating effectively. So these are two terms that you did in the double exam. Design means the way the system has been set up, and operating effectiveness is where we carry out test of controls to make sure that the systems are actually operating like I was told. So in type 1, it's just the design. Things like, their salary slips are not pre-numbered. In type 2, the deficiencies in design. So they'll tell us their salary slips are not pre-numbered, plus the good controls, the key controls, they'll give a report on whether they are working effectively. So they said the salary slips are approved by the director. We confirmed this is true. So there are two types of reports that we could be asking from the service organization's auditors. In the AAA exam, you get additional marks for outlining the contents of each of these reports. Let's do a simpler version first before we get into the details. We know that we need to obtain an understanding of the client, which includes its internal controls, so that we can identify risks in the financial statements and perform procedures accordingly. So all we have to do, and this is the simplest version you can sort of understand and apply to exam questions, all we have to do is understand exactly what services have been outsourced and how significant they are. Understand what controls our audit client has over the outsourced area. So payroll is being processed by the service organization. Amazing. How is our audit client keeping an eye on their work? And then once we have this understanding, we're going to design and perform procedures based on how risky this area is. So this is the simplest version of the 3 steps that you need to apply to exam questions. Now, we have to understand the nature of the services that have been outsourced. For example, is it recording and processing only, or is it executing transactions as well? Exactly what has been outsourced. We need to see what controls the client has in place to ensure the completeness and accuracy of the financial statement amounts, and how the client is keeping an eye on the service organization. Whatever controls the client has in place, we will need to test these as well. Additionally, and this is important, see if the client is maintaining independent records alongside. So are they just blindly believing whatever the service organization is telling them for payroll, or are they sort of maintaining parallel records as well? We need to see how material those transactions are which are processed by the service organization. Remember, their work is only relevant if it affects the financial statements. We need to understand the relationship between our client and the service organization, and for that we need to look at the contractual terms between them. If we are not able to gather sufficient understanding from our own client, we will need to carry out additional procedures. So we were trying to understand exactly what's happening, but we're not happy with the information we have up till now. So additionally, we can get a type 1 or type 2 report from the service auditors. We can contact the service organization and ask for specific information that you require. We can also visit the service organization and carry out the procedures on their controls ourselves, or we can use a completely different auditor to perform procedures on their controls. Ultimately, one way or the other, I need to get assurance on the controls that the service organization has in place. Now, in the AAA exam, and of course in practical life as well, it is not sufficient to simply say these are the areas that we need to gather information about. We then need to go on to explain in the exam in particular the procedures that we will carry out as external auditors to gather this information. So we can review the contractual agreement between the client and the service organization. If the service organization has issued any reports, we can have a look at them. We are going to document the systems that the client has in place to review the work that is done by the service organization. And very important, I haven't spoken about this before this, but there are extra marks on the exam for this. You also need to ask the client's management whether the service organization has reported any fraud or any breach with law and regulation. Because remember, if a fraud took place at the service organization, or if they breached laws or regulation, this means that the amount that they've calculated for our audit client could also be incorrect. Additionally, and these are extra marks in the AAA exam, please ensure at the planning stage, once you know that something has been outsourced, you need to make sure you have additional time planned, because you need to get work done on their internal controls. And using the work of service organizations also increases detection risk, because there's a concern that we might not be able to gather sufficient appropriate evidence regarding that area. Now, as far as the reporting is concerned, and this is something very similar across experts and internal auditors as well, we are the user auditors, remember? So if we are giving an unmodified opinion, we cannot refer to the work of service auditor unless it is required by law or regulation. So for an unmodified clean opinion, we can't say, by the way, we use the work of a service auditor. However, if I am modifying my opinion because I was not able to gather sufficient appropriate evidence from the service organization, then yes, you can refer to this, but you will have to clarify that we are still the ones responsible for the opinion that we are giving. So it does not decrease our responsibility. We're going to be having a quick look at a question. As always, if you could please pause the screen. The client's year end for this particular scenario is the 30th of November. I haven't written that, but you can see the information over there. So just pause the question and then come back and listen to the debrief. So you're the audit manager responsible for SciTech, a pharmaceutical research company. They've given the revenue and operating expenses with comparatives. Now, they outsourced their function in June, so during the year. The service is being provided by ProPay, a small local company. all of the accounting records relating to payroll are maintained and kept by ProPay. Now, in previous years, the control environment and related controls were deemed effective, and therefore lesser substantive testing was done on salary expenses. So super, last year they had the controls within SciTech and they thought the controls were good and they were operating well. So they reduced substantive testing. But this time around, they've outsourced it to a service organization. So my work is going to change. Remember that as you answer this question. You have to discuss and conclude on the impact which outsourcing would have on our audit planning. So this is a typical requirement for your outsourced organizations questions. So we're going to link the following areas wherever possible to the scenario. This is the answer sequence for all questions where we're going to be using the work of the service organization. You're going to outline the understanding that needs to be gained, explain how further understanding can be developed through the type 1, type 2 reports, etc. You're going to outline the procedures to perform to gain this understanding, and finally any additional scenario specific points as well. So very quickly, in terms of finding out about the nature of the services, let's get into the detail, and this is where the application marks are coming in. I need to find out who is initiating the transactions. So we're talking about salary payments, deductions, payments to tax authorities, etc. If it is the service organization, then my detailed substantive procedures should be done on the records that the service organization maintains. We also need to find out then how this data is transferred to my audit client. So remember, if SciTech does not have any records, then all the work has to be done on the service organization's records. In terms of controls and the interaction between the two companies, I need to find out if SciTech maintains any independent records or as backup, because if they don't, this means they are relying completely on ProPay. And if this is the case, there is a higher risk of errors because there is no independent check by SciTech at all. We need to evaluate the materiality of the amounts processed. Salary is 8.4% of revenue, therefore it is material. Additionally, the capitalized development costs will also have an element of salary expenses. So combined, payroll is a significant transaction cycle which has been outsourced. So we have the key understanding points that we are linking to the scenario. The further understanding points are quite straightforward. We can get a type 1 and type 2 or type 2 report from the service organization's auditors. We can contact ProPay to get specific information. We can visit them to perform procedures, or we can use another auditor to perform procedures. In terms of how we can get this understanding, we can look at the contract, we can review any reports which were issued by the service organization, and we're going to look at how the systems of my audit client and service organization actually link together so that I can see where the impact on accounting records is. Some very important technical and professional skills marks. So last year, because payroll was maintained by the client and they had strong controls, this is amazing. But now that this has been outsourced, we need to see how strong the controls at ProPay are. So we need to know the systems that they operate, what their own quality control procedure is, how my client is monitoring their work, and if any errors have been recorded within the payroll data. So if there's any experience of errors, I would know their work is something I will need to investigate in detail. We also know that for payroll in particular, there could be a lot of compliance issue, and therefore we'll also see if the results of any inspections of regulatory compliance that we can look at. So just to quickly wrap up, we have covered two different areas in this video. So please do make sure that you practice the related questions on the practice platform so that you can apply your knowledge to AAA scenarios and evaluate your understanding of exam technique. For both of these topics, step number 1 would be outlining the key steps or the contents that I explained in the video, and step number 2 would be relating them or linking them to the scenario wherever possible.